Okay, sorry about that. Then I always get flustered and like, "Ugh." So I just so appreciate this opportunity. This is a wonderful chance to come. This is a topic area that is near and dear to my heart. Just a brief introduction. My name is Troy Anderson. I am on faculty at the College of Social Work at the University of Utah. I spent about 14 years working at an outpatient diagnostic center at the university for individuals with Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. This was an innovative approach, and I actually did my dissertation work on integrating health education and social work into the diagnostic experience and into a neurology sort of diagnostic center. My job was, and our whole focus and goal was to diagnose individuals as early as we can, but also then to engage the family support, the social work role from the diagnosis, the point of diagnosis. Historically, what's happened, unfortunately, is that even if people can access a diagnosis, most of the time there's this significant delay, and usually people don't start to say, I could use some help with some of the day-to-day aspects of the care, but we usually don't even begin to realize that until we start to feel some burden and some strain. And that might be a number of years beyond that point of diagnosis. Especially if somebody, because I would say that our diagnostic technology is advanced well beyond our ability to treat these disorders. So we really do have effective ways to diagnose different forms of dementia in a very early point in the disease. And so we had access to those resources at the university. And so and often people might say, well, why intervene so early? Why diagnose so early? And really what we found is that window, that early window, is the time when we could do the most to help in the process. And that relates both to the individual with a dementing illness as well as the family. Because what we want to do is, if I am presented from the doctor with an individual has a specific diagnosis, I can tell with pretty good predictive ability the nature of that journey, the nature of where this will likely go as the disease progresses. So I can work with families to say, these are the things that you need to be aware of. These are, I've kind of tagged it in my talk about, these are mile markers on a journey. And I can, now each individual has a different speed in which they're on the journey, right? Some individuals, the progression occurs more rapidly, and some much slower. But the mile markers still remain relatively the same. Now again, with some variability. And so the way I want to try and approach this today, and I also want to give a quick note to, I've been asked to talk about grief in the dementia journey. Now, there's also joy in the dementia journey. There also are moments and there are also really good life lessons when it comes to, working with individuals. One of the things that I often will tell caregivers is we often push to have the individual join us in our world. And often the best goal is to find a way to join them in their world. And again, I do think there are joys in this, and but it's not all grief, but there is a lot of grief when it comes to this journey. So what I want to try and do is just track through the traditional journey, hitting on what I view, this is not some scientific approach that says this isn't like stages of dementia like you might hear from the Alzheimer's Association, but these are the points where I see in my clinical work where we have these moments of pause where we go, oh my goodness, we're in a new situation. We're in a difficult window of this, in this journey. And so that's kind of what I try and do is just kind of walk it through. And these are what I view as the points in time where there is a critical pause in change, but also a critical pause in needing to alter the way that we're engaged in the care. I'm also going to be making, so in addition to talking about these points in time and some of the associated grief, I'm going to be hopefully including in there some life lessons that I've learned in recommendations about how best to address these points in time. So we'll just kind of go from there. So I've titled this sort of the diagnosis to death. And again, I was worried about, that sounds just very discouraging. That's not a title of like a movie you want to watch, right? No. But it is the most important word in that is the journey and this trajectory. So one of the things that we do know about almost all forms of dementia that we work with is that they tend to have a relatively slow, steady progression, and these changes are subtle. That's why we don't have those so often those moments of pause, because it's so subtle, the change. We have to embed in the journey those moments of reflection to say, where are we? What has changed? What might we have lost as we've got to this point? The other thing that's important is that the stress and the burden is cumulative, but still subtle. So again, when you're deeply in that process of caregiving, we don't often sort of take the pulse of, how am I doing as a caregiver? How am I doing related to care strain or possibly even care burden? And often what it does is we just keep doing our job with head down, and then we have some sort of physical, mental, emotional point where we just get like, all of a sudden we're doing okay, and then we throw the dish at the wall or something, because we're so overwhelmed and stressed. And so often, again, the other thing too is that often we look in hindsight, we reflect back. And often we are critical of our own caregiving journey, because in hindsight we could say, oh, I wish I would have done this, I should have done that. And I'm going to give you some suggestions on hopefully the things you might consider. So I'm also going to point out these points of pause and reflection, like I've said, and these small wake-up calls. And usually these wake-up points are related to functional change, and where we have those wake-up moments where it says something's different. So again, mile marker 1. The diagnosis is an interesting journey, and I don't know, if we had time, it'd be interesting to hear about some of your experiences, because they can be deeply flawed and deeply varied. And this is one of the concerns related to the diagnostic process. Again, I mentioned we've got amazing diagnostic tools, but we have limited access. So if somebody lives in a rural area, if they don't live near an academic center, often these resources are not available. And again, I think sometimes if somebody were to visit with a primary care doctor, they might do some type of brief cognitive assessment and then say, grandma has dementia, which, again, back to my role, if somebody came into me and said, my mother has dementia, I would not be able to guide them on that journey, because that doesn't give me enough information. What type of dementia does mom have? That's the information that I need. But often families are not even, there's not available resources to be able to get that definitive diagnosis. But there's also stuff that goes on before the diagnosis. There's something different. I'm a little worried about this. I'm noticing some changes. We have what's called mild cognitive impairment, which is a window of time where we begin to see cognitive changes, but it hasn't got to the point where we would make that clinical diagnosis of saying this has progressed to the point where we can call this dementia. And again, if we had time, I would explain that a little bit better. But again, there's this worry, there's something not right, but there's also a lot of reluctance on the part of the individual who's having the memory change. We see that all the time. I've just been tired lately. I haven't getting enough sleep. I need to do a little more Sudoku. Everyone has memory changes as we age. And so there's a lot of factors that lead to even getting the individual to be willing to go in and talk about this is a very difficult process because it's scary. And there's a lot, and I don't think, I use the term denial I don't really like. I view it more as a defense mechanism than I do somebody being, really difficult, a difficult patient. No, this makes sense because, it's become another term that we used to think about when we would talk about a new cancer diagnosis. This is probably one of the most feared diagnoses for those as we age. Yes, please.
The other thing is they don't want the label.
Exactly.
They don't want to, they don't like it when I tell people my husband has dementia. Oh no, I don't.
Right.
Kind of thing. They don't like the label.
And the important thing here in that journey is it's not critical that that person necessarily owns that, but the problem is when they start doing things that they shouldn't be doing, like driving. Because there might be, it's not necessarily, like I said, you don't have to tell them every day, yes, you do have Alzheimer's disease. But the hard part is when we start saying, no, you shouldn't drive. And so it comes to these tasks, it becomes more important that, and one of the things, and the other interesting thing about this is the changes that occur in the brain affect the area of the brain where we have that insight, that personal awareness, that sense of being able to assess my own capability, being able to assess my own strengths. And we do what I call, we fill in the gap with the historical truth, if that makes any sense. So I use the example, simple example. What did you're in the clinic, what did you have for breakfast today? Patient says, eggs on toast. Spouses spouses almost lose their neck comes off the bone, like with the flagging you down, like that's not, you get really good at, the peripheral vision of watching the spouse lose their mind over here. But again, the filling in with the historical truth is every day before I went to work for 50 years, I had eggs on toast. Today, it so happens I had oatmeal. But if I can't recall, my short-term memory is the thing that's most affected. So I'm going with my historical truth. Now, it doesn't matter at all, but one thing you do learn is don't ask a question you don't know the answer to. That's what you learn as a clinician. But it doesn't matter so much what somebody had for breakfast. But what matters is when that individual's saying, I am a damn good driver. I've never had a ticket. I've never had an accident. And I was a professional driver. I drove long-haul vehicles. This is where it gets really complicated and difficult. Anyway, so that's enough with this slide. Again, resistance. So the point of the diagnosis, again, and the other thing I would mention briefly is the diagnostic process, at least where I worked, was very overwhelming. We do an MRI, we do blood work, we assess for depression, we do a battery of neuropsychological testing that can last like 4 hours, which is overwhelming. I sat through it a few times and I didn't do it. I was just watching and I was totally tired when I got done. I mean, it's a really daunting process, but it does give us that information about where we are in the journey. And there is often a lot of these terms are terms that we use routinely in a grief response. Shock, denial, bargaining, depression. So these are things that we routinely would see. But there's it's really tricky to kind of be faced with that diagnosis, be faced with it. So it's difficult for both the individual and for the family. The family members are like, yep, I knew that's what we were dealing with, usually. They may not have known what kind of dementia, but they're saying, yep, it validates that. But with the individual, often there's that resistance. The other thing I'd say, and I'm not going to go into this in detail, but the other thing I would say is that there are over 80 causes of dementia. We treat, routinely we treat 6 or 7 different types of dementia. And the important thing about the diagnosis is the journey with each is different. The pattern of change is different. And I'll just compare Alzheimer's disease with frontal temporal dementia really quickly. So frontal temporal dementia impacts the frontal lobe. That's the part of our brain that guides and determines our judgment, our decision making. It controls attributes of our personality and our social interactions. People with frontotemporal dementia become profoundly socially disinhibited. I'll tell a real quick story. I was working with a gentleman who had frontotemporal dementia, upstanding member of the community, of the LDS faith, never imbibed an alcohol in his life, went with the family to TGI Fridays. A table cleared behind him, and they left about 3 or 4 half-empty beers on the table. My client goes over and sits down and starts to drink these in rapid succession. Now, that is profoundly out of his character. It's profoundly out of his historic personality and his historic, and it's bad judgment even if you love beer, let alone if you don't. But that's very different from the way someone with Alzheimer's disease would act. And that's the critical point of this, because each of these complicated disease states has very different symptoms as it progresses. And then the point of the diagnosis, the doctors often feel like, oh, we've done our work, hurrah, we got it figured it out. But at the family level, it's really, this is the critical juncture of now what? And what does this mean? And that's where I would say the social work role really shines when it comes to the now what and where are we going in our journey. I love this idea of the map that families need. You need a map. You know, if somebody walks into we don't have travel agencies anymore, I don't think. You know, it's just like online. But if you went and said, I want to go on a trip, well, to where? You know, and give me a map to get to where I want to go. Well, I don't know where you're going. So if we know where the destination is, we have a much better idea about how we get there. So let's talk about the grief in this mile marker 1. I know I got to pick up the pace a little. The challenge here is this is a moment. Often individuals in this diagnostic time window are often somewhere between the age, in the retirement window, basically. So usually somewhere between late 50s to like mid 70s is that normal time window. Now, you could have, as a couple, you could have been planning all kinds of wonderful things that we're going to do when we retire. We're going to get the RV, we're going to go sit by the lake. And that's one of the grief moments of the early stage, is that our life plans are changing. What we had hoped for, our hopes and dreams are changing. And I would say there's sides to this. Because the disease does progress slowly, we don't have to, it's not like maybe with an aggressive cancer diagnosis, we say we have 4 months to go get our bucket list checked off. It's not like that. But we do know that it will change what we had planned and what we had hoped to do. And I think that's one of the aspects of this early point. Yes, please. Oh, okay, good. Don't tell me that. We'll be here till Sunday. Thank you, though. Okay, that's helpful. So I don't feel rushed. Okay. The other thing that's very tricky is do we tell, you mentioned that, so do we tell family? What do we tell our friends? Because people do act differently, unfortunately. If you've got a close-knit set of friends, you always socialize together. And then I think it does impact the way that person feels in the context of a social interaction. And I think it really is a tricky decision. But there's flip sides, because on the other hand, I think that if the individual might feel considerably more stressed if they feel like they have to act in a perfect way that's not going to give any indication that they do have a memory change. One of the things that I've noticed with the clients I've worked with is, and you probably will relate, is that there's often this tendency to tell this. So if this is the first time you sat with this person for a while, they might tell you a very vivid story that lasts about 8 minutes. If you hang out with that individual for 30 minutes, you'll hear the story 3 times because it starts back over. It's the story that I'm now focusing on. That's the one thing that happens often, is that it depends, whatever that focus is, and usually it can be anxiety driven. So maybe what I'm worried about, I'm going to keep going over my worry list with you over and over and over again. Where are we going today? What's where, and whatever that worry is, there's that tendency for that tape to just replay over and over again. Because that's what's primarily present in that individual's focus, their cognitive focus at the moment. So anyway, back to the socializing. I do think that often it is helpful to share, at least with close friends, that these changes are occurring. And hopefully they won't say, sometimes again, in the early stage it's not so much, but there is sometimes a tendency to feel awkward and then not to want to be around as much. And I think that's one of the hard parts about this. But certainly one of the things that we have to grapple with. So one of the tips we would focus on here in this early stage is that there is clear, well-documented research that indicates that physical exercise is as comparably as effective at altering the progression of the disease as the medications that we have available to us. Now again, it doesn't stop the disease, it doesn't halt the disease, but it can alter the progression of the disease. The focus of this early phase, one of the focus of the early phase is maintaining good intellectual, social, and physical activity. Primarily, the most robust research is on the physical activity. Cardiovascular exercise. But that doesn't mean that somebody that has good cardiovascular exercise can't get Alzheimer's. I've had people that are marathon runners that develop this. But it does impact. It also improves depression. It improves quality of life. It improves sleep. It's the best way to deal with stress. So these are things that we want to do. One other thing I would say is that one of the changes that occurs in dementia is the ability to have that initiative, that focus, I'm going to go, that get up and go, the what am I going to do today? So you almost need to have an exercise partner. Now, the other thing I want to say from the get-go and early on is we need to delegate. So primary caregiver, spouse, delegation, I didn't write delegation in my talk enough. Delegating tasks is critical from the beginning. So you might say, we've got a neighbor that loves to walk in the morning. We're going to make that connection for a variety of reasons. First of all, we need to take stuff off of your plate. But the other thing is we want to take the onus of being the, I'm going to say it this way, nag, to do things. We want to not always have that be focused on that primary spouse caregiver, because it actually increases the amount of contention and the amount of reactiveness toward that individual. We want to protect that individual in their role. It's a critical role. So what I would recommend to families is we want to build the team early. We want to have as many people. When I would meet with families at diagnosis, I'd say, bring everybody. Bring everybody that you can, because I want to engage people early in this process. The other thing I want to do is getting specific affairs in order. Goals of care conversations. Getting advanced directives, making sure those are complete. There's a difference between advanced directive and post form. And I'm not going to go into too much detail, but the advanced directive, we would want engaged, everyone that's over 18 should have one. A post form we don't even fill out. This is a physician's order for life-sustaining treatment. We don't fill that out until somebody has one of these progressive diagnoses. But the most important is having that advanced directive. And who does that person want to be their agent or their spokesperson? We want to make sure that's completed. We want to know about what are their wishes for care. Because if we wait until the time window when we need to make that decision, that person will have lost their decision-making capacity. They'll have lost their ability to engage in that conversation. These are complex cognitive tasks and decisions. So we need them to be participating in these as early as we can. End-of-life preferences and goals of care is so much more than, do I want CPR? We get so focused on, do I want to get intubated or CPR? We're talking about, what type of care do you want? Where might you want to live? And then I do think this is the time when we engage in doing as many activities as we can that we wanted to do. Because it does get harder. Honestly, it gets harder as the disease progresses to travel. to do certain things. And so this is a time we want to be addressing that. Okay, so mile marker 2, these are not necessarily, these aren't scientific, but this is when we begin to see some functional loss. It's when we start to see issues related to what we call instrumental activities of daily living. These are the higher level cognitive tasks. I don't know if you can see that. Yeah, it's kind of a little bit blurry. But these are all higher level cognitive tasks that get lost earliest. So we see changes to instrumental activities of daily living first, and then we see changes to activities of daily living after. Driving is one of the most contentious conversations that we engaged with ever. And it's interesting because it represents probably the best representation of loss of independence on the journey, or maybe placement into assisted living. Those are the kind of two key transition points. But driving is very difficult. And again, the key is one of the beauties is we have access to an occupational therapist that can do a formal driving evaluation. Because what we know is just because somebody's been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease doesn't mean they need to immediately stop driving. But it does mean they're going to need to stop driving at some point. The occupational therapist allows us to be able to have a very clear marker of where we are in that process. And they give us a score of 0 to 100. And it gives us so much information to say, when do we stop that? But you need to start that conversation early.
And you know why I like it too, is it's not me telling you we can't
Exactly.
drive anymore, it's the occupational therapist.
Right.
Who said, and it was clear he was not passing the cognitive part. He
Right.
was going only in.
Right.
And when he got in the car, she didn't even get on the freeway.
Yes. Was it Brooke? Oh no, maybe.
I think it is Brooke.
Yeah. She has a harrowing job. She has a break on her side. And I'm not being glib. I apologize. But it is it's an interesting process. But that's so important that someone else is that. Yes. Yes. But you have to be the one to remind.
Well, I had to also agree when we went that I said, if they tell you, will you agree to it?
Right. And the problem is, I've lost my short-term memory, and so it's not a once and done, right? I mean, I'm sure you've had this conversation more than once.
You still hide the keys.
Right.
And you don't register their truck.
And you don't just unplug the spark plug wires. And in the new cars, they don't do that anymore. But I had a person, a family that just disabled the car in the garage. Well, this person didn't know how to fix the car, but they knew historically, I just call AAA when this stuff happens. This fine young gentleman comes out, oh, dearie, this plug's good, and off she goes. And they even put a sign inside the hood. If you're from AAA, do not fix the car and call this number. I mean, again, these are stories that have a little bit of comedy relief in them, but they're very stressful points. This is a very stressful part of it. Finances. So this could be a major role reversal. That individual might have been the one that's managed the finances for their entire adult life. There's these role transitions, and it can be quite challenging. And this is when we start to see the real changes, when we start to say, this is real. This is something that's really, and before that it was the more vague. And these are the point where we really start to see the threats to independence and stress on that primary relationship. So again, there are grief issues related to this stage. There's a lot of role confusion and conflicts, threatening of that independence. And the caregiver is the easy primary target. And again, I think that's what we're going to keep working on as we go through this talk. So some recommendations in this phase: expand the care support network. I just say that every time. We need to have many voices. So again, back to your story about the doctor being the bad guy. If you've got a family, let's say you've got an adult child that you could be the bad guy. You can just vary who gets to be the bad guy, right? Rotating surrogate bad guys. Does that make sense? Right, because we want to protect the spouse. We want somebody else to be that bad guy. It can be we want to be careful a little bit about it being the doctor, because we don't want to damage the relationship with the doctor. Like, I'll never go back to that doctor because he told me I can't drive. We want to get everybody involved. The other thing I'd say about the social interaction is we need lots of individuals involved in the social interaction, because I remember when my parents died, their conversations were really funny. They didn't sit and chat about all these detailed, cool, nuanced things. It was like, did you get your pills? Did you have a good bowel movement today? Or just like, it wasn't like complex social interaction. It was really like these really unfortunate, mundane topics. And then my stepdad had hearing loss, and yelling. It was never really great. And and the irritations. This is a point where we start to plan for the time window when somebody needs 24-hour oversight or supervision. That is another really tricky transition point. And what we want to do is, if we can, engage. Let's say you have 5 or 6 adult children that live in the community. Want them each to be actively involved in a routine way, in a structured way. It doesn't have to be a lot of time. We want to get them used to participating in this process. The one thing that most primary caregivers make, the biggest probably mistake, I guess, although it makes sense, is that they say, oh, my kids are busy, my grandkids are in soccer, they don't have time. And we keep doing just the one caregiver through most of the journey, and we really don't want that to happen. We want as many people involved in a structured way as possible. It doesn't have to be a lot, and there are people that don't have that luxury. But if we have the luxury, we want everybody to be involved. If there's an adult child that lives on the East Coast, then they might be involved in managing finances and doing some banking online or whatever. There are ways to engage people in different ways that takes it off the plate of the primary caregiver. And again, this is another time window. I'm going to say this a number of times, but we're saying take time to process the change. You almost have to sit down and discuss with family and say, look, because there's grief and loss with each change. But again, often we don't reflect, and then we're sort of flooded toward the end with a lot more of that grief, because this is a decade-long grief process. Proactive use of respite care. Now, this is one of the other critical points I'll make. The primary caregiver needs to have structured blocks of time every week, predictable times where they can say, I know from noon to 5 on Thursday that I have somebody that's always going to be there. Now, one thing I'd say about neighbors is, I'm not meant to be negative, but I call it filler. They might be the one to say, okay, yeah, could you pop over and say hi? But you can't say to your neighbor, please be here every Thursday from noon to 5. It's just too much to ask. And so neighbors can be helpful, but we need to have them be in a role that is reasonable. But if we don't have family, then you've been out in the lobby. There are agencies that provide what we call personal care supports. Now, again, I have to say this, as a social worker, our whole lens is that we work primarily with individuals with minimal or no resources. And so the ability to engage a personal care agency is expensive and a luxury and a privilege. But if you can, but having these structured time windows is critical. Because then you can say, every Thursday I've got, I meet with friends for lunch. It needs to be enough time where you can relax. If you do 17 errands and you're harried and you're running around, you're freaking out, you're not getting a break. It needs to be downtime. It needs to be time when you can decompress. So you need to have enough of these where you get, and the other one, like the weekend respite, is like wonderful. I finally talked to one of my, I had a woman that was caring for her husband with frontal temporal dementia, and she kept putting it off. And she said she basically drove down the street and checked into a motel, and she said she slept for like 40 hours. I was like, you delayed too long, right? We wanted you to be able to have this every single week. And again, I'm not suggesting in any way that this is easy to set up, but it's very important to set up. Okay, I need to move along. When am I really supposed to stop?
The conference ends at 3:30.
Well, I'm not going to go that long, but
I would say, 10 after 3.
Okay.
Timing of people here.
Perfect. Okay. I will move fast. The third marker that I look at is when we get into the more severe, significant changes related to, this is what we call activities of daily living. These are the more mundane tasks. This is the bathing, the dressing. This is stuff where this is where you get to the point where you need that 24-hour supervision. This is a critical junction when we go from, my loved one is fine if I go run to the grocery store or do errands. And often we find out that, unfortunately, it wasn't okay because they went for a walk. But planning for that need for supervision, this is truly a very important and difficult transition point, because it goes from, really takes it out of the role of an individual to be able to do this. Again, we want to be doing this way before so we don't have to. But often we want to avoid that crisis point decision making.
But one of the challenges right now is there's housing issues of being able to get people in.
Absolutely. No, COVID is like, beyond, but even without COVID, but it's increased the sense of guilt. You know, can you imagine you just put your loved one into a assisted living just pre-COVID, and then all of a sudden lockdown and isolation and exposure to heightened risks? One of the things we look at is complicated grief is about looking back over your care journey as a caregiver and reviewing, in hindsight, we're saying, I should have never done that. There's no way to say today, November 20, whatever it was, 2019? There's no way to say, oh my goodness, there's going to be a global pandemic that's going to really have a drastic impact on people living in assisted living and care facilities. And so that's part of that reflecting back on this grief process. Safety issues increase significantly. So we've gone from risks of driving to even risks of daily routine activities around the home. You know, leaving the stove on or going for a walk and getting lost. This is also when really the nature of that primary relationship begins to get most challenged. Why do we partner? We want somebody we like, that we want to share the journey with, right? We want to, a spouse that we love to be with them. And really what we start to do is losing attributes of that relationship that were really the glue that kept us together for 40 or 50 years. Doesn't mean the love has changed. Doesn't mean the commitment has changed. But the quality of that interaction and the personality and the engagement changes. This is more difficult, I think, for spousal caregivers. I think for adult children caregivers, it's still tricky to say, we've lost who he or she was. But for the spouse, it's devastating. I've seen second marriages, and that's devastating, where we lose our memory in reverse. So that person's like, who are you? Why are you here? Where's Bob? Why are you getting to bed with me? And if you've loved this person for a decade, talk about grief. They don't even recall you. They don't want you to be around them. And it's so difficult. Okay, let's keep moving. So this is my high-tech artistic skills at doing my slides. But it is sort of a clear thing that as these caregiving demands are on the incline, the quality of that, and I mean the quality of the nature of the relationship is changed. And again, it's subtle, but so this is another really important step. Critical to maintain friendships, critical to maintain hobbies, critical to maintain activities that you enjoy. This is so important in this transition process. If you don't do this, when your loved one dies, you will be staring at the wall and saying, I have no idea who I am. I have no idea. I'm not connected anywhere. I've got no friends anymore because I've always said no to lunch. For the last 5 years, I've said I can't go to lunch. You've lost the things that are intellectually engaging and challenging. And you feel like you've kind of lost your soul in a way. And that makes that long-term grief so much more complicated and high risk for complicated grief. It's so important, and let others help. Often we'll say, I'm the only one that can do it like this. I know exactly like this and this, like the pillow here, like this snack at 2. Teach somebody else to do it and let them do it. Because it's so important that you not be in this role all the time. And, yes?
Just one quick comment on that. I have had several friends who have been through this, and those that fail to do these things, when their spouse dies, dutifully within a few months die themselves.
Yeah, thank you. And it's so sad. My mother was one. Right, she died 9 months before my stepdad. And she died because she made a decision to not treat her pneumonia because she was so tired of being in that role, I believe. And I do believe you're exactly right. And those are things that sustain us. Meaningful activity, being engaged with stuff that's meaningful in our life is so important to longevity and surviving this journey. And I've had multiple caregivers die before their loved one. Okay, let's keep moving. So I think residential placement is another huge transition point. And I've done some dementia caregiving groups, and this is a quote from one of my group members. It was placing my loved one in the veterans home was considerably more stressful and painful and guilt-driven than their death was. Now, again, we have all these things, where the care needs exceed the ability, but again, there's those things of like, but I promised. And also, I think this is a difficult time when, even if you have that placement, where some people feel lost. I've lost my role. I've structured my life around caregiving so much that I have nothing to do. And then they go to the nursing home all day long. And that's not necessarily wrong, but you got to strike that balance. You let them do the care, but this is a very difficult transition point. And back to my social work hat, it's not accessible to most people due to the cost. And so many people are left with, we would place my loved one, my father, my mother, my spouse, but we can't afford it. And so this is another huge thing. I could give an hour-long talk or more on the fact that we're not addressing the cost of long-term care in our society in any fashion, and this is going to grow increasingly more devastating. This is a really important slide I want to just talk about briefly, but this is a model of grief that I think is a very important thing to think about when it comes to how do we deal with the grief process. The goal is to bounce back, to oscillate back and forth between loss orientation and restoration orientation. Now again, this is another hour-long talk I could give, but just to grasp the concept, the goal, so most people get consumed with the loss orientation. And they don't allow the time to do the restoration. What that restoration means what I've just described. Maintaining relationships, having plans for future, continuing to live, continuing to be, and not being, engrossed in the grief all the time. This is one of the core themes that we talk about over and over in our grief groups that we run for individuals of caregiving for people with dementia. So some tips here. Again, preparing for the transition to residential. It's difficult to do. Be realistic about your abilities. Most people do this until they're so spent that they just are having a breakdown or having significant health crises. Have a team support the transition. Back to that, not have it just be spouse saying, the family encircles you, the other people that you can help with that. Again, set some structures or limits around the time at the facility. I'm not saying in any way that it's wrong to go and be with your loved one, but to be there from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. or whatever doesn't reflect what I just talked about with the restoration and the loss. So we're still talking about that. And then again, this is another time to process that loss. Okay, hospice transition, I'm almost out of time. This is another marker. The thing that's hard with hospice with dementia is it's just not as clearly defined a point as it is with other disease states. It's just often quite vague. It's often difficult to mark. But it is a transition that says we're moving in that direction. The progress even on hospice can be slow. You know, sometimes I think the average time on hospice is like 7 days, which is not really speaking to dementia, because this is probably the disease state that people would stay on it much longer. But it's sad because the average length of stay on hospice ought to be 6 months or more. That allows the hospice team to actually be helpful and beneficial. But there's a point here where it's like, I'm not ready to accept that death is nearing. And I think that's the hard part, one of the hard parts with this. And it's hard for the reality to kind of set in. So one of the things we look at is, what are those historic wishes? I think, again, when I talk to people, I work in the ER, and I talk to people about more in a sudden critical event, stroke, heart attack. Often the people are saying, the question is not, what do you want for your loved one? The question is, what does your loved one wish if this were the scenario? If they were presented with this information, what would be their choice? And that often is a really tricky point for people to, even if they're the dedicated advanced healthcare directive agent, they grapple with that concept. Because what I wish for my mother, she would have got her IV antibiotics and she would have kept living. But it wasn't my choice. It was really supporting what her decision was. So what's the quality of life for both the individual and the caregiver? Let the hospice providers really guide the process. These are experts. They can speak to you about the process someone goes through as they near death. Create your own plans for I'll give you another quick story. I have so many stories, and my father was dying at his skilled nursing facility, and we engaged a hospice team. And I say this in jest, but the guy came with the guitar, and we're just like, and he's playing the guitar, and we're like, yeah, this is not working. But the good news is you have the relationship with hospice. You can say, there are aspects of your usual approach that we like, but I don't think, when we're here together and you're over in the back of the room playing the guitar, this doesn't work. So I think having a plan, talking about your plans, having that relationship with the team is just really important. But also to be flexible. And there's a lot of education. If somebody's dying, they might say, they need water. And actually, I've got physicians in the room, but I'm not one. But, as somebody's dying, the worst thing we can do is give them fluids. Because the body loses its ability, the kidneys shut down, the ability to excrete that. And so the hospice teams are great about being able to instruct what to expect. What does this look like? What are these stages? And kind of don't be distracted by what could be, but be present with what is. This is a beautiful time to engage in sort of reflections. You all right? Luckily, we've got a physician in the room. I'm going to have water too. Hopefully I'll get down the right tube. Not in the lungs, though. So death is this other next mile marker. This is where caregivers get deep in reflection about what I could have, should have done, and often feel guilty and feel a lot of, it influences the grief process to feel like I didn't do enough, I should have waited, I should have done this, I could have done that better. The fact of the matter that you do your job the way you do for this long, they should give an award every year for everyone that's engaged in this work. Back to my soapbox, the unfortunate thing is our government, our policies basically are saying, it's up to you. You guys just deal with it. We're not going to help you with this. We should give awards to people that do this job on an ongoing basis. The empty hall, care review, so these are mixed emotions. empty hall. I mean, one of the things that happens often when we, like let's say one of the things that happens when we lose our social connections is that we lose that social network. And so often when we get to the death point, our social community is diminished. Not always. And then I like this misguided meaning making. Oh, what a relief. You must feel such a relief. Your journey, you don't have to care for the person anymore. There's all these really unfortunate things that people say that are an attempt to say something or to make you feel better. I really, even from somebody has a spiritual background or a religious background, assuming what God wants is not our role. To engage in that sort of pseudo meaning making, I think, is one of the things that is probably the most common flaws in trying to provide some solace or support for individuals after a death. And then again, I think this critical, if somebody has maintained that loss orientation, restoration orientation, they're so much better able to make the transition back to some life than they would if they hadn't done those things. This is a point where if they haven't done it, they are deeply lost. They don't have a role, they don't have a meaning, I don't have any orientation toward my day, and my structure toward my day. Okay, this is the last one, 7. So again, these transitions are very complicated. Dementia has been termed sort of the long goodbye. That's why I said we need to take the moments of reflection, to take the moments of grieving the loss along the journey and not wait until the death. And this could amount to, we gather together, maybe with that person, maybe not, and we just talk about, maybe you've got a family, you bring the kids together and you take them to lunch, and you say, how are you feeling about where we are? How do you feel about what's changed? We have to make a meaningful, structured, you have to structure that conversation because it doesn't just happen. I think it's important to do throughout the journey. This in the caregiving role often leads to significant isolation. And I think that's the last, yeah. So again, I didn't leave us with a lot of time to questions or comments, but I don't know if you have any. We have like no minutes. I want to just acknowledge everyone that's engaged in this. I mean, I think it is, it's a heroic effort. Dementia caregiving is probably the most difficult. Even with other conditions, we don't have that same situation where aspects of that relationship are changed so drastically. Often many of those attributes or those aspects of the relationship are maintained. And so I just think I think it's just a really heroic journey. And but really the point is get help early, keep help going, let other people do it, maintain those outside, and you can't do this alone. This is not a single person's job at all. So, all right, thank you.